Good morning, everyone. My name is Kyrre Haugen. I'm the General Manager of the Norwegian-British Chamber of Commerce. And on behalf of my team and our Finnish co-organizers, a very warm welcome to this highly relevant and current panel conversation on ESG and human rights. We have put together three very passionate ESG experts with different backgrounds and organizations with vantage points to discuss trends, to share views on opportunities and pitfalls that companies face today, and to give the audience practical ESG takeaways. So our great panelists are Rocio Paniagua, excuse me, correct me if I'm wrong, Paniagua, Head of Business Integrity Program, Transparency International, UK, Mariana Abro, Head of ESG and Human Rights in Walbrook Advisory in London, and Nina Skjefte, Head of Social Responsibility, Group Sustainability, Norsk Hydro in Norway, Oslo. And to moderate this conversation, we have Dominic Martin, VP Governmental and Regulatory Affairs at Equinor, UK. The event will be recorded and will be available for downloading afterwards. Private questions cannot be sent directly to panelists, so any questions you may have must be written directly in the Q&A box. We may not have time to answer all questions, but we will certainly do our very best. So, thanks to me, Dominic, the show is yours.
Thank you very much, Kyrre. And well, first of all, it's great to be back at the Norwegian-British Chamber of Commerce after a few years away and to be chairing another event here. And it's a great event. I absolutely agree with Kyrre. We've got some fantastic panelists. And I'm going to put my hand up at the beginning and say, your chair is much less expert in the subject than the panelists. So please indulge the chair if he comes across as being an ignoramus compared with the three experts we have on the panel. The way we're going to do it, we're going to hear from each of our panelists in turn, and then we will have a little bit of a discussion between the panelists, because I'm sure they'll want to pick up on some of the points that each other have made, and that will be a very interesting conversation. And then we will end with a Q&A session, and I hope lots of people will be able to participate in that. And what I suggest people do is when you have a question, don't wait till the end of the session to start writing your questions in the box. Start writing your questions as soon as you think of them, and then we'll build up a list of questions during the session. So the Q&A boxes should be at the bottom of your screen, and just write in the question that you would like to ask, and then I will see them, and then I can put them straight to the panelists when we get to that session. Anyway, we're going to start off with a presentation from Rocio, who is, I have to say, in the interest of full disclosure, because this is a transparency event, Rocio and I work very closely together at Transparency International, of which I am a trustee and a board member, and Rocio is one of the dynamic members of the TI team in the UK, focusing particularly on business issues. So over to you, Rocio.
Thanks very much, Dominic, and thank you to the Norwegian-British Chamber of Commerce for having us, and to my fellow co-panelists, and to Kyrre and Neosha for organizing this event. So I don't think that anyone could argue anymore that corruption has an effect on human rights, a long-standing and devastating effect, and it can affect every sector and every context. For example, public procurement is one of the top corruption risks for government. And when there is corruption in public procurement, it has as an effect that public services are not delivered, key public services are not delivered or are partially delivered, which at the same time, of course, has an effect on human rights. For example, in the case of anonymous companies, which is an area that we work a lot in TI UK, anonymous companies are used as a vehicle for hiding the proceeds of crime, corruption, tax evasion, money laundering, and these resources are diverted and should have been used to give effect to human rights, but instead of that, they end up in the pocket of the corrupt. So these are just a few examples of those linkages, and corporations can use a few tools to mitigate negative human rights impact, and also to mitigate corruption risk. And these are, for example, transparency and due diligence. In my presentation today, I'm going to focus on transparency. And corporate transparency legal requirements, of course, they are not a silver bullet, but they are a method that can be used, and it has been used for a while in the human rights theme or field. It has been, we can go back to 2010 when the California Transparency Act was passed, and following from that legislative piece, we have seen the UK Modern Slavery Act in 2015, in 2014, the EU Non-Financial Reporting Directive. So we go back far in time, and we have seen these pieces of legislation being issued, which has, I think, provoked meaningful disclosure on human rights. What is happening in the anti-corruption theme? Unfortunately, we have seen more scattered disclosures from companies, and these scattered disclosures are due to scattered legislation and lack of enforcement, but also are due to the fact that the business case, I think, since hasn't been properly evidence-based and hasn't been properly and comprehensively gathered. There has been a lack of guidance, and I think that that was one of the reasons why a year ago we decided to do a piece on anti-corruption disclosures. Just when the UK was looking for the first time a year ago, we launched Open Business. This is a study that we produced, and that it lays out the business case on anti-corruption transparency, and also it identifies 5 high-risk corruption areas that we think that companies need to first address, but also demonstrate that they address. These 5 high corruption risk areas are anti-corruption program transparency, beneficial ownership transparency, country-by-country reporting, organizational transparency, and corporate political engagement. So Open Business, what does it do? It is specifically called for companies to be transparent about their corruption risks, and I think we are a long way ago the time in which companies they just need to behave ethically. I think they need to demonstrate that they do that, and they do that through transparency. So what is clear is that civil society, consumers, investors, and other stakeholders, they expect business to practically manage not only corruption risk, but also human rights, regardless of the fact that there is mandatory legislation that mandates them to do that. So, and given the linkages between these two agendas, what we think is that we should mutually reinforce our efforts. And that's, of course, from the civil society side, but we talk also about regulatory efforts in this space. So we have seen this recently, well, a few years ago, as I mentioned, the EU Non-Financial Reporting Directive. This is a piece of legislation that address reporting duties through the different, the 3 ESG risks. So again, this is an example of regulators holistically addressing these risks. We hopefully will see that with the piece of legislation that will be issued shortly, or this year most probably, on the EU mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. We have been supporting our colleagues from TIEU to make sure that anti-corruption is included as part of the scope, because we think this should be harmonized across those risks. And finally, we need to see businesses addressing these risks holistically. And there has been guidance for different organizations from, for example, the OECD and the International Organization of Employers, asking companies to address this risk holistically. and look and evaluate the differences between, for example, human rights and corruption, but look into the synergies, learn from each other, and join forces when suitable. So I think this is the last message I want to leave you with, to mutually reinforce our efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Rocio. As you say, these issues around transparency, particularly perhaps in public procurement, could not be more topical than today. Okay, our next panelist is Mariana Abreu, who is from Walbrook. And Mariana, why don't you say a little bit about yourself and about what Walbrook does, and then I think you're going to talk about rights and ESG in due diligence processes.
Thank you, Dominic, and good morning, everyone. And thank you for inviting me. I'm very excited to be part of this conversation with all of you today. And yes, quickly on my background. So I am originally from Brazil, and I'm a human rights lawyer. And most of my career has been working on human rights investigations into multinational companies, both in Brazil and across Southern Africa. So I have worked at large NGOs such as Amnesty International and Global Witness. And more recently, I've joined Walbrook and managing their ESG and human rights practice. For those who don't know, Walbrook is a ESG due diligence firm based in London, but with offices across the world. And I manage the ESG and human rights practice, and the idea is to bring my expertise from the activist background, investigating companies now, to work with clients, advising them and helping them improving their policies and practices. And I thought for the presentation today, I would bring a practical perspective on what I have been seeing the past year or so, working with different companies and investors, but mainly focusing on the Norwegian clients I've worked with. And definitely very aligned to what Rocio was saying. In the past year or so, investors and companies have been increasingly integrating human rights, ESG, into their traditional compliance and corruption checks. And I think before, up until 2 years ago, the main issue we think about ESG used to be the environment, the climate change crisis, but and I do think COVID has more prominent. And in the past year, large organizations such as the OECD and the United Nations Working Group on Business and Human Rights have published papers speaking about the importance of integrating corruption due diligence checks to human rights and ESG checks. And we've been seeing this growth at Walbrook in practical terms. So, for example, clients that before, companies before that would just ask for corruption, anti-money laundering, financial crime checks, now are asking us to have a look at ESG and human rights as well. And these checks can happen at different moments of your business deal, of your partnership. So, for example, I thought I would share some case studies with you before entering into a deal. So if you're an investor and you're deciding whether you want to make an investment or to acquire another company, we would look for any human rights and ESG risks related to that. And that, from a risk perspective, has two angles. One would be the financially material ESG risk that often helps the client negotiate a better deal, but also a reputational risk, because now looking at NGO reports, media, more and more not operating in alignment of what is best practice from an ESG and human rights perspective, it becomes a reputational issue more and more. So just for an example, let's say we have there is a company that is investing into a construction company in Dubai. What we would normally do, we would look at the material risks for the country and the sector. So in the United Arab Emirates, labor rights is a major issue of concern. So this is one of the issues we would be focusing on and investigating and checking what are the labor conditions of workers working in this company if labor rights are respected, and if not, if so, we would flag this to the client, and in case we find anything that would be not aligned to what is considered best practice, we would develop recommendations for them to improve if they wish to do so. But then after the pre-transaction, you also have when you're entering into a business partnership. So if you are joining a joint venture, or if you're any kind of business partnership, these checks have also need to be done, especially when you look at frameworks such as the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. You have responsibility for the business partnerships you get into with. So these checks have been done, and if you get into a business partnership with a company, let's say, that is causing adverse human rights impacts, you might end up having a certain responsibility in regards to it. So you have to be very careful about it as well. And the third one is when companies are looking at their own operations and what they are doing, and we call it human rights impact assessment. So, and that's a deep dive into the company's operations, looking at their policies, procedures, what they're doing, and then looking at all human rights risks and impacts, and developing a set of recommendations to help them improve their policies and practices. I think I'll stop here. Just one last thing, because I think it's also a nice segue to Nina's presentation. I think in the past year or so, also ESG litigation has very much increased. Even though ESG is still very much voluntary, the companies that make public commitments to, let's say, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights or other initiatives, more and more activists and lawyers have been going to court when they find that companies might not be acting in accordance to the public commitments they have made. So something we've been really careful about when we work with companies is to only make a public commitment when you are fully prepared to implement what you're saying on your website that you're doing. Otherwise, there is a risk of litigation. But I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mariana. So we've heard from a civil society organization at the heart of the ESG debate from Rosio. We've heard from a company that of a consultancy that advises companies on how to handle some of these risks. And our last panelist, Nina Schefter from Hydro, is going to tell us what it feels like to actually be in a country that is handling these risks on a day-to-day basis in some of the perhaps more challenging places around the world where we encounter these challenges. So Nina, over to you.
Thank you, Dominic. I will try. I have a short presentation, so I will try to share that with you. I hope you see it now. Let me see, there. You see the presentation?
Perfect, Nina, we can see it.
Yes, thank you. And thank you so much for this invitation to participate in this panel and to discuss a very interesting topic. And I will share 3 topics with you today. I will first give a brief introduction to Hydro, because I guess some of you might not have heard about us before. And then I will also give a short overview of the main content in our human rights management. And then I will go into some of the experience we have for operating in complex affected areas. First, Hydro has 115 years of experience of industrial development. We have now 34,000 employees in more than 150 locations in 40 countries. And we are a Norwegian company, so our headquarters is in Oslo. And Hydro's purpose is to create a more viable society by developing natural resources into products and solutions in innovative and efficient ways. We are fully integrated in the aluminium value chain, from bauxite mining and power production via the smelting and to end product. And in the past year, we've started to expand in the renewable energy sector and batteries. Our main countries where we have operations are Brazil, the US, Germany, and then Norway. And in Hydro, human rights have been part of our business agenda for a long time. But just as Richo and Mariana has mentioned, we see an increase in the focus the last couple of years. So we also have seen a need to be more clear on whose rights and which rights we should focus on. And in our management of human rights, we focus on 3 target groups. It's our own employees, it's employees working for our suppliers, and it's the people in the local communities where we operate. And on this slide, you see the human rights we are at risk of impacting the most, also called the salient issues. In Hydro, we have decided to call this our major risks to people, since it's a more familiar term, and it's easier maybe for people to understand what we're talking about. And by prioritizing in this way, we have seen it useful for us to narrow down our scope to focus our efforts, and also to build a common language in the company on what human rights are to Hydro, and also to build a better understanding of how cross-functional human rights are. It's not something that we only work with in the group sustainability. It's something that should be worked with and focused on throughout the company. And then we, as many other companies, we base our human rights approach on the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible business, and focus on where we see the highest risk for adverse human rights impacts. So the 4 points here are main focus areas. And the first is due diligence, as already mentioned. And you see in the illustration here, the outer circle is our due diligence approach. And it's integrated in our enterprise risk management process, meaning that we seek to identify risk to people alongside risk to business. And in higher risk countries, we conduct standalone deep dive assessment, just as Mariana mentioned. And we do environmental and social impact assessments in new projects, major developments, and on larger expansions. And importantly, we do also risk-based due diligence of our suppliers. When we go to the policy, commitment, and governance part, human rights are integrated in our policies and governance documents, such as the Hydro Code of Conduct, the Human Rights Policy, Supplier Code of Conduct, and so on, and other key procedures. And then the next point, the stakeholder engagement. I will come a little bit back to that when we start to talk about more specifically on issues in Brazil. But that is very important, and it's also important for being transparent, just as was mentioned earlier, that the transparency of the work here is very important, to be open on what we do and how we do it. And that one thing there is to engage and collaborate with stakeholders, and then also to report and be open on it, how we report our performance in the annual report, for instance. And the final point, the grievance mechanism and remediation is also an important step in the process. So then I will take you to Brazil, we have our operations in Brazil, mainly in the northern part of Brazil, in the state of Pará, and that's where we have our bauxite mine, and also we run the largest aluminum refinery in the world. And in general, the trust in the mining industry in Brazil is very low because of some catastrophic incidents the last decade. And the political situation and the priorities from the government challenges also international standards and rights, for instance, for indigenous people. So it's kind of challenging to be in such a country then. And if you go to the state of Pará, where we run the world's largest alumina refinery, the situation is even more challenging. It's a region where the development indexes are low. Some of the communities have extreme high level of violence, and there are also weak institutions. So the question here is how do we contribute to social development and respect for human rights in such weak and complex environments, and how can we catalyze positive change? So, and such a complex environment requires a broad engagement. This slide shows a summary of the most important measures taken by Hydro in Brazil to contribute to positive development in these communities. I will just focus on 3 of them. And the first one, as I already mentioned, stakeholder engagement is really key. And for every year we are in Brazil, we spend more time and we more resources on the stakeholder engagement to really understand the situation and to follow the development, of course. And last year, we had more than 850 dialogues and meetings were held with more than 104 stakeholder groups related to our operations in Brazil. And the other thing I would like to mention is the Sustainable Barcarena Initiative, which is an independent platform set to promote dialogue and social change in the municipality of Barcarena, where we see the most challenging and complex environment. And that is, and Hydro initiated this platform and supported it from the beginning of 3 years ago. And the purpose for the platform is to bring all stakeholders together to discuss, prioritize, decide on critical issues in the city, and also to reduce the conflict level, to strengthen the ability of local actors to drive social change and development. And of course, the purpose for this platform is also to initiate programs and supporting the communities and the local people living there. So it's so we're also committed to and have established a Hydro Sustainability Fund, where we have committed to support this platform by 100 million Brazilian reals over a 10-year period, and that is about 13.4 million British pounds. And then finally, the last point I would like to highlight here is the human rights impact assessment, just as Mariana mentioned, because it's we've been in Brazil for quite some time, but still we saw the need to have even better understanding of the situation, because there's a lot of historical things impacting our operations there as well, even though we haven't been there for that long time. And we did a human rights impact assessment in 2019, and then more than 260 actions were identified, and we are now in implementing and finalizing and closing some of them already. So to wrap up this introduction, I just wanted to highlight that our social responsibilities as a company is first to assess and mitigate risks to people directly or indirectly impacted by our operations, but we also have opportunity to support and develop the societies where we are present. So we also set a specific goal that we want to empower for 500,000 people with educational skills by the end of 2030. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nina. Could I ask you to yes, that's right, size down, that's brilliant. We can all see each other again. Fantastic. Well, so 3 very interesting perspectives there. And what we're going to do now is move into a sort of discussion amongst our panelists. But let me try and see whether I can draw some initial thoughts to sort of frame that discussion. I mean, I think what we're hearing is that this is a growth area for companies. This is an increasingly important part of the focus of boards and corporate executive committees in all businesses. It partly reflects the increased public spotlight on some of these issues. There's pressure from the general public, there's pressure from investors, there's pressure from governments. I think we're also hearing that the legislative framework is a bit fractured. The enforcement and regulatory frameworks are not consistent necessarily. And so it's quite difficult for companies always to know what their obligations are in different environments, and how we balance that sort of reputational angle versus the legal angle versus the wider issue of public expectations is obviously a real challenge, and I think Nina and the others brought that out very well. So I'm gonna ask each of the panelists in turn a question. So perhaps start with you, Rocio. I mean, for companies that are looking at this agenda and a bit daunted by it and saying, we recognize it's important, but we're only sort of thinking about it systematically for the first time, how does an organization like Transparency International UK engage with companies who want to improve their focus on business integrity issues?
Thanks very much, Dominic. So I think we do it in different ways. Perhaps I can tell you what we do as part of the UK programs in the business integrity kind of section. So we produce guidance. So we have our portal is an anti-bribery guidance that is free of use, and you can find it in our website. We produce also thought leadership pieces. So I talked about open business, but also very recently on the 4th of May, we launched a report that addresses how companies ought to be measuring their approach to anti-corruption. So I think if we are asking companies to disclose meaningful information, for them to be able to do that, they need to be able to measure whether they are able and they are effective in mitigating their corruption risks through different kind of metrics. So again, we try to produce thought leadership piece that could be used by companies to understand how to better manage their corruption risks. The third piece in which we are currently working is to look into values-based compliance. So how can you use behavioral science as a company to really reduce or mitigate your corruption risks? Again, so this is another way in which we engage with companies. We also use benchmarking. So either we use publicly available information, as we have done in some studies that we issued in 2015 and 18, looking into lobbying risks and understanding through the publicly available information that companies issue, how do they engage with the political sector. And we also have, in terms of benchmarking, what we call our anti-corruption, corporate anti-corruption benchmark, which is another tool that companies that participate in this product, what they do, and that's not publicly available, is they self-assess their anti-corruption programs against their peers and against TI good practice. So we are helping companies to improve the quality of their programs and the way they mitigate corruption risk. And finally, we also have a forum that we convene that is called the Business Integrity Forum. We gather with these anti-corruption champions 6 times a year and discuss horizon scanning anti-corruption themes, like, for example, a few examples of the sessions we have had looking into the use of artificial intelligence in anti-corruption, looking into the links between corruption and sustainability and climate. This is and looking into issues like trade and corruption. So we, as Dominic, as you have seen, and you know, we engage with companies in different ways. The idea is to help them to improve their anti-corruption practices.
Okay, Roger. Well, sounds like there's lots of resources available for companies that were interested. One suggestion, maybe in the chat, yes, you could put the web link, so that yes, if people on this call would like to sort of see yes, some of these free resources that are available, okay, they could click on the link. So if you could do that, would be brilliant.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so let's go to Mariana and ask a similar question there. So, you know, I'm an investor, or I'm a company, and I'm thinking about my portfolio or my activities across the world, and I just want to get a handle on the risks that I face. I mean, how can companies assess risk? I mean, what sort of advice would Walbrook give to a company that wanted to say, how on earth do I actually assess the ESG risks in my portfolio?
Thank you, Dominic. I think that's a very good question. And what is interesting on the ESG space is because it's still very much voluntary, even though we see it's getting more and more regulated. Companies come to us in different moments of the so-called ESG journey. So some companies will come and say, you know, I've been asked by clients more and more about ESG, but I don't even know what that means. So, you know, really at the beginning, so our work's very much, you know, hand-holding and take them on this journey. And I think the first step and what we see very often is a company that will say, well, I just want the ESG, you know, policy so I can put on my website. And that's what we completely advise against. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done before getting to that step. And that's where our advisory work comes to help a company setting up their ESG program and ESG policy. And a key part of a first step on that is similar to what Rocio was saying, is benchmarking. So we'll look at your peers, so companies operating in similar sectors, similar jurisdictions, and see what they're doing. So once we understand, okay, what's the state of play, we'll see with our client, where do you want to be? Do you want to be a leader there, or do you want to be with your peers? I can tell you, no one says they want to be behind. And I think that really sets the path that we'll go. And a key part of this process, I think that's one of the most important buzzwords in the ESG world, is stakeholder engagement, which Nina has said earlier. And in this case, we do both internal stakeholder engagement, and for those who are not familiar with this term, it's just basically talking to people. So internal stakeholder engagement, because often, you know, especially when you're talking about investors, they think, deal teams may think, oh, you know, now I have to do these ESG checks. I won't be able to do my work as freely, you know, it's going to be an obstacle on the way I do my work. So it's very important to have this internal buy-in and teams understanding what ESG means, but also when you're developing your policy, also understand what these teams want to achieve. So also you don't create unnecessary obstacles that will prevent them from succeeding in their roles. So that can be a very challenging process, you know, navigating all these different interests, but still coming up with a policy that will make sense and represent progress. And then you have the external stakeholder engagement, which means people that are not part of the company, they're not staff members, but might be an NGO that is looking at this issue. So you want to get their perspective to take this on board, to avoid, you know, maybe down the line having a report targeting you. So you want to gather all these different views and perspectives to come up with a policy and an ESG program that will truly make sense to you and to your company, and that can actually be implemented. Because an off-the-shelf policy might seem like something easy to achieve quickly, but I do believe that there is a higher risk in having an off-the-shelf policy than not having a policy. I think it's better not to have a policy, and then, you know, you come up with something very, very tailor-made for your reality, and then that will be effectively implemented. Because having a policy and not implementing it is the highest risk scenario I can think of.
Very interesting. Okay, the importance of stakeholder engagement, and I think you're saying you can't take shortcuts here. I mean, you actually have to do this systematically, and well, that come to Nina here then. So Nina, I was very impressed with your presentation. You showed all the great things that Hydro does around the world to sort of comply with what Mariana's advising us to do, and yet, you know, I'm going to put you on the spot here a bit. You know, I read news articles about all the problems that Hydro is facing in some of these countries, and lawsuits for various ESG issues that Hydro is facing in the Netherlands and in Brazil and other places. So how is it that a company like Hydro, with all the measures you're taking, still running into problems?
Well, thank you for the question. It's interesting, and it's quite complex, I would say, and especially in a complex environment, as I described briefly. I can see in some of the communities where you are present in Brazil, there are many stakeholder groups. So a stakeholder dialogue or stakeholder engagement can be quite challenging, actually, to find the right stakeholders to have the dialogue with, and the interest for the different stakeholder groups are not necessarily the same, and sometimes they also are in conflict. So it can be challenging to mitigate the impacts of one group without increasing the conflict level among the groups, for instance, as an example. But the good thing is that the majority of the stakeholder groups are open for dialogue and want to join collaborative processes, just as the Sustainable Bank Arena initiative, as I mentioned. And then we have some stakeholders that prioritize to have a more confrontational approach, including raising lawsuits to achieve compensation for their members. And of course, we respect the plaintiffs' rights to bring the lawsuits forward. And we want to respond with facts and evidence as requested, before the courts where lawsuits is being filed. But I think one of the key here, I think, is also that it's in complex environments, and being the biggest company and the main employer, we can't solve the situation for everyone. And when you then have a complex situation, and another part, just as Rocio mentioned, you have the corruption perspective here as well, which really impacts, just as you mentioned, the access to public services like clean water in this Barcarena community, or sorry, in the city, is only 30% of the people there having access to clean water and sanitation, and of course that it says something about their rights, and so it's and that they have a lot of their human rights is not in place. So it's so I think the answer to that question is that I think even though you have a systematic approach, you try to do the best you can, and you want to be a responsible company, there will always be someone who is not satisfied. And of course, we are committed to the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, and the ICMM, the International Council for Metal and Mining, and ILO 169, and so on and so on. And we have stated in our human rights policy that we are committed not to interfere or hinder access to any grievance mechanisms or any processes. So it's from one point of view, you can see it's good that it's possible to raise these complaints, but it's also important that they are based on facts and evidence. So it's so I think that example it shows that I think any company can experience these type of complaints, and I think we will see that they will increase. The number of complaints and lawsuits will increase in the future. So it's as a company we need to be prepared, and we need to do the right thing from the beginning.
Okay, so even the best prepared company, you need to understand that you should be ready for challenge.
Yes,
and they can come from lots of different quarters.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, look, I've got some very good news to share with everyone, which is that the questions are starting to come in on the Q&A chat. We've got a couple so far. I'm looking for 3 so far, but so do type in your questions now. I'm going to give the panelists one last question before we go into the Q&A session for them to address. And it's this, and I'd like you all to answer this quite quickly, if I may, so we can do the. So in one sentence, could I ask each of you to say, what do you think is the single most important trend in the ESG world today that companies should focus on? And what is the thing that is happening out there that the trend that you're looking at and you think companies need to be aware of this, because this is going to be really important in the future for them? So who wants to go first on that? Rocio, do you want to go first?
Okay, thanks very much. So not surprisingly, from my point of view, would be the link between business integrity or anti-corruption and responsible investing or impact investing. And because at the moment we are seeing responsible investors looking into the impact they have on climate, on gender, but unless you looked into your corruption risks, you're not going to be a responsible investor and have the impact that you are wanting to do. And hopefully we will start a research on that in the next months. So
very good.
There you go. Thank you.
That was quite a long one sentence, if I may say, Rocio. Mariana, see whether you can make your sentence a little bit shorter than Rocio's.
Okay, I'll try. Yes, I think taking human rights as seriously as taking corruption and financial crime risks.
Excellent. Very crisp. Nina.
Well, I will continue your sentence, Mariana, because I think also to take it as serious and environmental and climate impacts, because we see human rights, it has attention from customers, investors, internally from board of directors and all levels. Human rights is high on the agenda now. So I think every company needs to be prepared to do comprehensive and good due diligence processes on human rights.
Okay, so attitude of impact investors, human rights risks, attention on them, attention on environmental and climate risks. Quite a lot for people to think about. So I'm going to go to the questions that are coming from our audience. And the first one came from Maral Mirshahi. One of the challenges, she says, one of the challenges in addressing business integrity risks is to identify the sector-specific risks, particularly when it comes to human rights and labor rights. Bribery and corruption can often look the same, and we have definitions of what constitutes corruption. However, do we have literature, studies, frameworks, legislation that systematically list the various types of human rights and labor rights breaches that can occur in different sectors? Who wants to take that? Raise your hand so I can see you. You're all. So it's basically, is there a clear definition of what we should be looking at when it comes to human rights and labor rights?
I don't see the raise hand function, but I can respond to that.
Okay.
Yes, there is a clear definition on United Nations Human Rights Conventions. So you have 9 United Nations core human rights conventions. Key ones are in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And then you have other treaties that are more focused on specific groups, such as women, racial discrimination, and so on and so forth. And you also have what they call the core ILO, International Labour Organization conventions. And this is the framework for human rights. And it's a lot. I think if you count all the rights, there are several, I have never counted, but it's quite a lot of documents for you to check. And I don't think there is anything linking each right to each sector. I think that's where the expertise and background in truly understanding a sector, but also a country, really comes into play. And that's a core part of our due diligence work, because, you know, construction sector risks in the construction sector in the UK are very different from risks in the construction sector in the United Arab Emirates or in Brazil. So it's a combination of thinking about a sector and a country and the specific risks linked to each case. So there is not really a tick box exercise. That's why I think you have to think about each case separately.
Thank you, Mariana. Did anyone else want to come in on that? Or shall I? Yes, Nina.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that I totally agree with Mariana. It's not, you don't have one book or one guideline where you could find every information you need regarding different sectors and human rights. But we have very good experience by working together with other companies in collaborations like it could be Transparency International, where we had a good cooperation for many years with them in Norway, but also we have been working with the Danish Institute for Human Rights, where we are part of their Nordic network, which is very useful to discuss with other companies from other industries, topics related to human rights. And we always learn a lot from other companies as well on issues related to different sectors. So I think to be open to and join partnerships with other businesses and with NGOs or competence centers or institutions, I think at least for us, it has been very important to develop our human rights agenda.
Okay, so thanks, guys. I'm going to read another question, a really interesting question from Kira. And he's addressed it to you, Nina, but I think actually all 3 of you will have views on this. So Kira says, Nina, you made reference to how Hydro considers cross-functional human rights, and he agrees with that. But in many organizations, it's the sustainability team that tends to be the natural function to lead human rights risk management. But as soft law principles increasingly become hard law obligations, where do you see the role of in-house legal or compliance teams fitting into the human rights piece? More broadly, who are the key stakeholders for you at Hydro in terms of operationalizing your human rights risk management program? And before you answer that, and I think there's I'd like to expand that beyond just the human rights side and to think about the corruption risk and others. And I think one of the risks that you see in some companies is that, that people within companies think, environment, human rights, corruption, anti-corruption, that's the job of the sustainability team, or that's the job of the compliance team. I don't need to worry about it. They've got that all handled. How can companies ensure that these ESG issues are properly mainstreamed within companies? So Nina, I'll give you the first chance to answer that as it was addressed to you, but then I'll give the others a go as well.
Well, yeah, thank you. Well, it's a very interesting question because I mean, implementing these things it's really a journey. It's continuously in development, and one of the challenges is exactly this, that is so cross-functional. So what we have done, I guess it's many different ways you can do this, but how we have done this when it comes to the human rights, as I mentioned and showed you, we have identified the 10 major risks to people, and we have also identified the cross link with the 3 target groups I mentioned: our own employees, our employees in the supply chain, and people in the communities where we are present. And then we have linked that to the different parts of our organization. So of course, when it comes to our own employees, it's HR who are the main responsible for implementing the human rights for our own employees. And then when it comes to the supply chain, it's much more to the responsibilities with the procurement teams and out in the different business areas. And then when it comes to the people in the communities, it's linked to the plants or the people or the organization we have out in the communities. So we have tried to break down the 10 major risks to people into where it should be included in our operations. And then to the question on going from soft law to hard law, it's what we see is positive effect of that is that the interest among our colleagues in the legal department is increasing. They see, okay, we need also to have attention on human rights. So it helps us being, I would say that we are now more coordinators of human rights in Hydro, and then the responsibility is out in the operation. We're maybe not yet there today, but that's what we're working for, that the management of human rights and the operational part of it should be integrated in the different parts of the organization, and then we can coordinate the work from group sustainability. So that's at least how we try. But of course, it's just as you mentioned, Mariana mentioned, it's internal awareness and competence. We really need to develop our own employees to better understand impact on people and human rights linked to our business, both directly and indirectly. So that's one of the things that we have been stepping up our training and competence.
Thank you, Nina. Brilliant. And I'm going to bring in Mariana and Rocio now to sort of address the same issue, and maybe frame it in even blunter terms, which is that for too many companies, I think, people see ESG as cost and loss of competitiveness. And how can companies turn that mentality into thinking about ESG issues as business opportunity? Who wants to go first? Mariana, do you want to take this first, and then we'll end up with Rocio, and that will probably bring us to an end of the session. So Mariana.
Yeah, sure. Just a quick one on the previous point. I thought it was interesting to share that just a month ago, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission published an advisory saying that compliance personnel should have oversight of ESG. So I do think there's a trend in compliance personnel having more and more oversight of ESG. But on your question, Dominic, I do think there's more and more a business case for ESG. I think that wasn't the case years ago, but I do think now with so many risks, reputational risks, litigation risks, but also ESG is a financially mature risk, and companies are realizing that. So it's not only doing the right thing; it's also it makes sense for them. And we often use a framework called SASB, the SASB materiality map, which lists ESG risks based on financially materiality. And so I don't think ESG is a cost anymore. I do think often, you know, if you go and do the kind of engagement Nina was mentioning, when you're engaging with hundreds of stakeholders, and then there are lots of resources that come into it. And I agree, impact assessments are a very costly process. But overall, I think it's kind of becoming the baseline that you have to take ESG into account.
Excellent, Mariana. And finally, Rotio, do you want to address those questions?
Yeah. Well, with regard to the first one, I don't think there is too much to add, but the way I see it is the key is expertise and cross-functionality. We have seen that with when we were doing our pieces on transparency and on matrix and measurement on how you manage anti-corruption risk. You need data people, you need lawyers, you need communications people, but expertise is the key, and cross-functionality. With regards to your second question about ESG and the business case, I would add also the transparency aspect. So looking into how you and looking into and addressing your responsibilities as a company and being transparent about that can help you with your engagement. So you would have investors that are more interested in looking and investing in your company. You would have civil society engaging with you, civil society groups, employers more happy to work with you, and also business partners, because when you are looking into your ESG risk and being transparent about that, people will want to, companies will want to do business with you. So, so I think there is definitely a business case there and an advantage to look into ESG risk and address them.
Excellent. Well, look, I think we've probably come to the end of our time. And just before I pass back to Kira, I'd just like to say thank you very much to all three of our panelists today. I think one of the great drawbacks of these sorts of webinars is that if we were in a hall somewhere, at this point, everyone would erupt into spontaneous applause and there'd be cheering and clapping and singing at how great a performance you've all given. Unfortunately, it's impossible in this sort of format, but just imagine all the applause and all the cheering that is going on amongst all the people who are participating in this event at the moment, because it's there, I can assure you. I've certainly learned a lot. It's very clear that ESG is not going away as an issue. In fact, the requirements on companies are getting tighter from investors, from governments, from public opinion. It's not something that you can leave to specialist teams. You have to integrate it into across your company. You have to have specialist knowledge and specialist understanding. And it's, if anything, going to get even more attention, ESG, in coming years: human rights, environment, climate, anti-corruption, and transparency more generally. So thank you very much to all three of you. It's been a great pleasure chairing this event, and over to you, Kira, to wrap up.
Thank you a lot. I hope that all the participants, you got some takeaways. If you have some questions, send me an email, and I will forward to the right panelists. So we are open for business. The Chamber of Commerce, we have a few events upcoming. Whether or not they will be online or offline, I don't know. Anyway, thank you all.